If you consider yourself a good person, you are likely trapped in a psychological cage built entirely out of other people's needs. We call this prison the hero trap, and it is the single most corrosive moral framework operating in modern society. It dictates that your worth is proportional to your ability to sacrifice your time, energy, and deepest desires for others, and that the supreme moral achievement is to render yourself empty for the benefit of the group. This is not nobility. It is a meticulously constructed system of emotional and practical exploitation. The greatest moral catastrophe of the modern age is not selfishness. It is the forced glorification of the sacrifice complex. We are trained from childhood to worship the martyr, the individual who burns themselves alive to keep others warm, and we rarely stop to ask why the onlookers are not capable of generating their own heat. This essay argues that the widespread moral panic surrounding egoism is a deliberate cultural weapon wielded by the incompetent against the competent, and that radical, intelligent self-interest is, in fact, the supreme and necessary virtue for a successful life. The system of conventional morality requires that the strongest, the most creative, and the most competent individuals perpetually operate at a net loss. This is the unspoken contract of the hero trap. You must suppress your own flourishing to manage the fallout of others' failures. Think about the classic structure of the hero narrative. It is defined by burdens. The hero is the one who steps in when the world collapses, not because they are inherently altruistic, but because they are the only one capable of lifting the crushing weight. Society, recognizing this immense capability, immediately assigns it a moral cost, obligation. Your talent is no longer your resource. It is the public's debt. But the fatal flaw in this logic is that a debt cannot be paid by an entity that is constantly being emptied. You cannot pour from an empty cup, yet the hero is continuously lauded precisely for cracking their own foundation to keep the public reservoir full. If you are tired of receiving shallow, sentimental answers to life's deepest moral questions, and you suspect that the comfortable narrative is designed only to keep you compliant, then subscribe now. This channel is dedicated to exploring the dark mechanics of human nature, and you won't want to miss the logical and psychological case we are building for radical self-sovereignty. We must separate genuine care from the socially engineered compulsion to sacrifice. The current definition of selflessness is nothing more than a refined mechanism for demanding unearned resources. When someone calls you selfish, what they are usually saying is, "You are failing to prioritize my desires over your own." They are not condemning your character. They are condemning your refusal to be coerced. True rational egoism, the philosophy we must adopt, is not the petty greed of a child hoarding toys. It is the rigorous architectural commitment to maximizing one's own existence, potential, and intellectual output. It is the understanding that a robust, fulfilled, and independent self is the only prerequisite for interacting with the world without becoming a liability. The true sin is not putting yourself first. The true sin is needing others to solve your problems because you failed to secure your own foundation. The hero trap demands that you apologize for your strength. Rational egoism demands that you cultivate it until it becomes unassailable. We must exit the cycle of resentment driven by forced sacrifices and reclaim competence as the foundational moral imperative. The moment you define your moral center as your own maximization, the hero trap collapses, and you finally understand the true source of your own power. The societal admiration for the martyr is a form of psychological tax evasion, allowing the collective to outsource its responsibility for competence. The only way to win this game is to refuse the title of hero entirely and become the master of your own domain. The psychological torment of the capable individual trapped in this system stems from a profound misunderstanding of validation. We are taught from the first moments of social awareness that our worth is measured by our utility to others. The hero trap doesn't merely appeal to our goodwill, it preys on a sophisticated form of vanity. The competent mind, recognizing its own superior capacity to solve problems, often mistakes the relief and dependence of others for genuine love or moral achievement. This creates a destructive feedback loop. The hero feeds their ego on the sheer magnitude of their burden, achieving a twisted sense of moral superiority by constantly operating in deficit. They wear their exhaustion as a badge of honor, whispering to themselves that they are the only ones capable of holding the world together. But this moral capital is illusory. It is bought at the expense of genuine self-development and personal joy, and it accrues an inevitable emotional debt known as resentment. Resentment is the slow poison that leaks from every forced sacrifice, every unacknowledged concession. It is the proof that the transaction was fundamentally unfair. You cannot volunteer for martyrdom without eventually hating the very people you died for, because they were the unwitting beneficiaries of your self-betrayal. To be free of this resentment, you must accept a terrifying truth. Your primary moral obligation is to your own flourishing, and anyone who profits from your misery is not interested in your soul, only your labor. This deeply uncomfortable truth, that self-sacrifice is often just a highly ritualized form of energy extraction, is exactly the kind of analysis the conventional media avoids. If you appreciate this relentless focus on the mechanical reality beneath the sentimental narrative, and want to support content that refuses to compromise depth for comfort, please hit that subscribe button. We are building a library of thought dedicated to maximizing intellectual clarity, and every subscription makes it possible. The pressure to conform to the hero archetype is immense, precisely because the societal structure depends on it. The collective does not fear your failure, it fears your independence. Failure is manageable. It provides endless opportunities for pity and control. Independence, however, is corrosive to the system. It is the ultimate rejection of the parasitic contract. When you achieve radical self-sovereignty, you become unreadable to the manipulators. They lose their hook because you have nothing left to prove to them. You are no longer accepting their currency, moral admiration, in exchange for your actual tangible resource, your time, your energy, and your intellectual power. The hero trap is a spiritual anchor designed to prevent the strongest ships from sailing too far from the harbor where they are needed for ballast. Escaping it requires embracing the terrifying reality of self-responsibility, a burden so great that most people would rather pretend to carry the burdens of others instead. They opt for the lesser yet constant anxiety of pleasing the crowd over the sublime, intermittent terror of total self-creation. The great lie is that competence necessitates altruism. The greater truth is that true competence makes altruism optional, not mandatory, transforming it from a social requirement into a deliberate choice made from a position of profound strength and surplus. Only when you are full can you genuinely give without resentment, and the state of being perpetually full requires the absolute rejection of the demand to be empty. The moment you start defining your own metrics for success, divorced from the cries of those who wish to use you, the entire infrastructure of societal coercion begins to crumble around your life. The world has convinced you that self-love is an act of rebellion. It is not. It is the only foundation for true ethical behavior. And the failure to secure your own well-being is merely the coward's path to perpetual servitude. The final verdict on the hero trap is simple. It is a scam run by emotional debtors, and the only moral path forward is to audit your own life. Close your accounts and refuse to pay for the competence that is already yours. This is the cost of freedom, and the subscription request at the end is merely an invitation. If you found value in this radical reorientation of morality, join the community now. Let us continue to examine the dark mechanics of the human psyche together. The profound resistance you feel when you finally choose yourself is not merely internal friction. It is the sound of the world's machinery grinding against the unauthorized intrusion of your freedom. When you refuse to pay, the system does not label you free. It labels you a thief, or worse, a traitor. Your competence, previously a tool of public service, instantly becomes a weapon of self-interest. And this narrative shift is orchestrated by those whose emotional equilibrium depended entirely on your continued self-sacrifice. They cannot comprehend a world where the strong do not exist solely to uplift the weak. Because if competence is truly sovereign, then their perpetual state of need holds no moral weight whatsoever. This is why the rejection of the hero trap is perceived not as independence, but as a spiritual crime, the highest form of arrogance. If this brutal revaluation of moral debt sits uncomfortably with your received wisdom, if you sense that the shallow waters of conventional thought can no longer hold you, you must subscribe now. You cannot afford to miss the next iteration of this painful truth, because society actively works to suppress it. The system must perpetually justify its right to demand your exhaustion. Consider the trajectory of Nikola Tesla. Here was a mind capable of rewriting the physical laws of the planet, a genius whose conceptual output remains unmatched in practical utility. But Tesla refused the hero trap. He refused to mold his highest intellectual ambition to the commercial, immediate, and frankly pedestrian demands of his investors and his rivals. He possessed a staggering, almost terrifying competence, yet he died relatively isolated, his final years spent in intellectual withdrawal. Why? Because he prioritized the purity of his vision, the long-term, world-changing truth, over the short-term transactional demands of the emotional debtors surrounding him. Chief among them the financiers who wanted immediate returns and the contemporaries who wanted intellectual dominance. His ultimate sin wasn't failure. It was the refusal to dilute his genius for the comfort of the mediocre. He refused to be their hero when he chose to pursue the ethereal, world-spanning vision of free energy rather than the mundane, localized profit model of direct current. He was systematically defunded, marginalized, and eventually mythologized into an eccentric failure. This wasn't because his ideas were bad, it was because his ideas were too good, too pure, and required a level of intellectual commitment that few others possessed or were willing to fund. The message society sent through Tesla's eventual fate was clear. Your genius is acceptable only if it is immediately profitable to us, and if it fails to serve the prevailing commercial narrative, we will allow you to starve in glorious isolation. His tragedy was not a failure of engineering, but a failure of emotional servitude. He thought competence granted him autonomy, when in reality it merely raised the price of his subjugation, a price he ultimately refused to pay. His example proves the thesis: intellectual purity, when achieved, necessitates a withdrawal from the moral economy of the needy, and that withdrawal is the single greatest act of self-ownership possible. It is the realization that your highest value is not the service you provide, but the consciousness that conceived it. And protecting that consciousness from dilution becomes the new, non-negotiable ethical priority. The world will always attempt to frame this necessary withdrawal as selfishness. But true selfishness is the demand that someone else must sacrifice their intellectual heights merely to soothe your psychological fear of the dark. We are living in an era where the most valuable resource is focused, uninterrupted attention, and the hero trap is the world's most sophisticated mechanism for extracting that resource under the guise of moral obligation. If you are finding this perspective valuable, if it is recalibrating your entire understanding of ethical action and competence, pause for a moment and consider supporting this work by subscribing. It is only through the shared commitment of people willing to stare directly into these uncomfortable truths that content like this can survive the pressure to retreat into safe, palatable mediocrity. The refusal to be a public battery drained by demands for effortless solutions and constant emotional support is the first step toward reclaiming your actual power. The refusal to be a public battery drained by demands for effortless solutions and constant emotional support is the first step toward reclaiming your actual power. The psychological mechanism used to prevent this necessary withdrawal is the seductive, comforting lie of balance. We are constantly told that life is about equilibrium, about splitting your focus equally between creation, relationships, health, and leisure. But balance is not a noble goal. It is intellectual entropy dressed up as wisdom. It is the philosophy of the fundamentally mediocre, a social tool designed to ensure that no single person ever becomes so focused, so radically skilled, that they become unrecognizable or uncontrollable to the group. True mastery, the kind that produces paradigm shifts, is inherently unbalanced. It necessitates the temporary, sometimes permanent, abandonment of everything else for the sake of the idea. It demands a monastic, almost psychotic tunnel vision that terrifies the well-adjusted. The great lie is that you can achieve the highest intellectual heights while simultaneously maintaining a perfectly curated social life, a six-pack, and a perpetually smiling demeanor for your family. This isn't a life, it's a spreadsheet designed by committee. It is the compromise that ensures your genius never escapes the gravity well of common expectation. The world doesn't want your 100%, because 100% of your focus directed solely toward an abstract, difficult problem is terrifyingly potent. The world wants your 25%, spread safely across 4 socially acceptable domains, ensuring you remain predictable, controllable, and fundamentally available for their emotional needs or commercial ventures. The pursuit of intellectual purity is the active rejection of this diluted existence, the conscious decision to allow imbalance to become your greatest tool. It requires acknowledging that the feeling of guilt you experience when you cancel a social engagement to spend 5 more hours in silent concentration is not a moral failing, but a physiological symptom of breaking free from the group's demands for conformity. If you are struggling with the relentless noise of conventional self-help that demands you dilute your focus for the sake of feeling whole, then you are recognizing the fundamental tension between the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of social acceptance. The two are mutually exclusive at the highest level of expression. If this analysis is cutting through the noise and articulating the deep resistance you feel toward these superficial demands, please consider subscribing. It is the clearest way to tell the algorithm that this difficult, uncompromising content, which refuses to water down complex psychological realities for mass consumption, deserves to exist. The hero trap, then, is essentially a guilt trap. Its primary lever is not profit or recognition, but the psychological weaponization of social connectivity. If you refuse to serve, you are labeled cold, selfish, or worst of all, irrelevant to the collective struggle. The price of withdrawal is social exile, or at least the anxiety of potential exile. This is why the most productive and intellectually rigorous minds throughout history often had lives that, by modern metrics of wellness, were deeply dysfunctional. They understood the zero-sum reality of focus. Every minute spent smoothing ruffled social feathers or participating in obligatory rituals was a minute stolen from the core mission, a minute lost to the vacuum cleaner of the collective psyche. The moment you internalize this truth, that guilt is merely the mechanism of control used by those who value your output more than your autonomy, you gain immunity. You realize that your withdrawal is not a narcissistic retreat, but an ecological necessity, preserving the rare, fragile ecosystem of high-level thought from the contaminating demands of emotional maintenance. This is the difference between operating from a position of competence and operating from a position of obligation. Competence says, I have built this, I own the right to deploy or withhold it. Obligation says, I must use this skill to alleviate the suffering that surrounds me, otherwise I am a moral failure. And that is the final, most sophisticated lie of the hero trap, that your capability creates a moral debt to the less capable. That capability creates a moral debt is the final, crippling stroke of the hero trap, because the debt is not paid in currency or time, but in the slow, agonizing theft of psychological sovereignty. The reason the victim suffers so profoundly is that the trap doesn't operate externally. It is immediately internalized. It exploits the deepest, most archaic human software, the need for belonging. To refuse the hero role is to invite not just criticism, but the much darker judgment of being a necessary part that decided to become a malignant outlier. We are wired to fear ostracization more than we fear failure, because historically, ostracization meant death. The hero trap updates this primal fear for the modern age: social death. The high performer is terrified not of doing the work, but of the existential void that opens up if they are perceived as unwilling to do the work. The internalized critic, built layer by layer during childhood when usefulness was the only recognized currency of love, enforces this contract mercilessly. It whispers that if you stop solving, if you stop serving, you cease to be valuable and therefore you cease to be worthy of space. This is the sophisticated mechanism of burnout. It is not the volume of tasks that breaks the individual, but the absolute inability to separate their fundamental identity from their function. They cannot distinguish between their innate right to existence and their acquired skill set. They are not merely someone who has competence. They are competence, and if they withhold it, they are committing identity suicide. The tragedy is that the very act of seeking validation through perpetual service only reinforces the illusion of the trap. Every time you step up to save the day, you solidify the collective expectation that you will be there for the next crisis and the crisis after that. You are teaching the system that your boundaries are flexible, your energy is limitless, and your deepest purpose lies not in your independent creation, but in the maintenance of the comfort of others. If this forensic analysis of the self-sacrificing psyche is articulating a deep truth you've spent years attempting to unearth, that the highest virtues can be the most dangerous psychological prisons, then I urge you to subscribe now. This deep dive content is fundamentally countercultural. It is the difficult, necessary work of exposing the moralized assumptions that underpin the entire self-help industry, and your subscription is the only metric that guarantees this kind of uncompromising, rigorous psychological deconstruction gets seen. The refusal to subscribe is an unconscious vote for the easily digestible fluff. The very content that reinforces the superficial belief that happiness can be found by simply smiling wider and trying harder to be the person everyone else needs you to be. What truly binds the competent mind is not the physical effort of the duty, but the crushing burden of managing the external emotional reaction to their potential refusal. They are paralyzed by the anticipated disappointment, the projected sadness, or the punitive rage of those who have grown dependent on their psychological output. We must realize that the emotional maintenance of others is perhaps the single greatest time sink and energy drain for the high-level thinker. And this maintenance is what the hero trap demands as its tribute. The moment you decide to prioritize the clarity of your own internal landscape over the smoothness of the surrounding social waters, you are already halfway out of the enclosure. You begin to understand that the people who penalize you for setting necessary boundaries are not mourning the loss of you. They are mourning the loss of your utility. And once you identify the parasitic dynamic, the moral debt vanishes, replaced by a cold, objective economic assessment of resource allocation. Your competence becomes a finite, precious resource, and the collective is instantly demoted from a righteous judge to a demanding, often ungrateful consumer. The ultimate act of intellectual preservation, therefore, is the radical self-definition of worth entirely outside the transactional framework of service. The refusal to be utilized is often misinterpreted as malice, but it is merely an act of intellectual sovereignty. Consider the archetype of the family anchor, the one sibling, the one cousin, or the one friend who managed to escape the psychological gravitational pull of systemic inertia and build genuine self-sustaining stability. This individual, whom we will call the competent node, is not just asked for money. They are asked to underwrite the existential weight of every other relative's poor decisions, lack of foresight, and refusal to implement basic structure. The calls they receive are not pleas for assistance. They are demands for psychological triage. They must listen to the predictable cyclical drama of the relative who refuses to work, yet complains about poverty. The relative who commits to self-sabotage and then requires emotional validation for the ensuing disaster, or the one who constantly creates conflict only to demand the competent node step in and restore a peace they did not shatter. The true tax levied upon the competent node is not the financial subsidy, though that is often ruinous. It is the psychic bandwidth consumed by managing the emotional narrative of those whose lives are, by choice or habit, defined by chaos. The deep, grinding resentment that eventually surfaces in the competent node is not against the people themselves, but against the sheer, overwhelming effort required to continually re-explain basic reality to those who have a vested emotional interest in misunderstanding it. It is the realization that their skill, their hard-won stability, and their clarity of mind are treated not as achievements to be respected, but as a collective emotional insurance policy against the consequences of others' negligence. This is the hero trap made manifest. Their ability to solve problems becomes their primary social vulnerability, and the moment they step back, they are instantaneously recast not as exhausted benefactors, but as selfish betrayers. If this kind of rigorous, emotionally honest psychological deconstruction, the dismantling of the moralized assumptions that govern our deepest personal sacrifices, is the content you need to navigate these complex, draining realities, please take a moment to subscribe right now. Supporting this work ensures that these deep dive analyses can continue to provide the framework necessary to distinguish between genuine responsibility and parasitic demand. The collective resentment toward the competent node is entirely predictable because their very existence, their demonstration of self-mastery, acts as a silent, unbearable critique of the unmastered lives surrounding them. Their presence negates the comfortable excuses of fate, bad luck, or systemic oppression as the sole cause of their relatives' distress, forcing the uncomfortable truth of agency into the conversation. Thus, the collective's primary defensive mechanism is not admiration, but a relentless passive-aggressive pressure campaign to ensure the node remains permanently tethered to the drama, constantly expending their energy and resources simply to prove that their success has not made them too good for the struggle. This transactional morality system attempts to extract proof of loyalty through perpetual suffering, demanding that the competent person remains psychologically compromised just enough to avoid exposing the willful incompetence of the collective. The hero is only acceptable as long as they are bleeding utility. When the hero stops bleeding, the system demands a moral reckoning, forcing the individual to choose between their psychological integrity and their social standing, a false choice engineered by those whose identity depends on your perpetual service. The essential, brutal verdict is this: the only way to survive the hero trap is to refuse to play the hero. You must execute a clean, surgical withdrawal, accepting the immediate, inevitable consequence of moral excommunication. The condemnation is not a sign of your failing, but the highest possible confirmation that you were correct to leave, because their anger proves they valued your utility, not your personhood. The moment you are branded selfish, you have finally bought your freedom. The competent person's ultimate act of self-mastery is the willingness to be hated for their integrity rather than loved for their service. You must recognize that your primary moral duty is to the source of your competence, to protect your time, your energy, and your psychological space from the entropy of others. Because when you sacrifice that source, you don't elevate them. You merely degrade yourself. You sacrifice the capacity for real contribution on the altar of manufactured sympathy, and the world gains nothing but another burnout case. The collective demands a hero who collapses, proving that excellence is unsustainable, thus justifying their own stagnation. Do not give them that satisfaction. You are not obligated to manage the psychological comfort of those who refuse to manage their own lives. You must choose self-preservation without apology. This is the final frontier of adult responsibility, accepting that your excellence will be weaponized against you, and choosing to protect it anyway, letting the resentment of the collective crash harmlessly against your newly erected psychological boundary. When you stand on that precipice and look back, you realize that true ethical contribution requires maintaining your own altitude, not descending into the swamp to prove you still care. If you are exhausted by the performative morality of the masses and are seeking a community that understands the true, uncompromising cost of competence and integrity, then hit the subscribe button now and join the thinking few who dare to define their moral framework independently of the parasitic demands of the many. The only ethical stance left for the exceptional is radical self-possession, because the moment you allow your light to be used merely to illuminate the mediocrity of others, you consent to your own gradual erasure. The final verdict is this: your competence is not a communal resource. It is the currency of your sovereignty. The highest ethical choice you can make is not the sacrifice of your strength, but the fierce maintenance of it. Do not fear the label of selfish, because that is the exact word the crowd uses to describe the individual who finally chooses self-ownership over servitude. Your mission now is not to achieve acceptance, but to attain untouchability. Let them complain that you are too distant, too cold, too focused. Those complaints are merely the sound of the chains they failed to wrap around you. The world doesn't need another martyr. It needs proof that competence can survive the envy of the mediocre. The greatest tragedy is not failure, but the slow, deliberate destruction of potential under the pressure of lesser minds. They punish your success because it reminds them of their choice to settle. So let them resent you. Let them call you a narcissist. That external hatred is the psychological armor that allows your true self to survive and flourish in a world desperate for your destruction. If you believe that truth is worth the cost of consensus, and you are ready to build a life based on radical self-possession, then make sure you hit subscribe right now. Join the few who understand that freedom is earned not by giving everything away, but by refusing to give up the core of who you are. The final moral accounting is not measured by the breadth of your sacrifice, but by the uncompromising depth of your achievement. You were given this unique competence not to become a communal tool, but to become a standard of possibility, a solitary peak visible on the horizon that proves the potential of the human will. Do not apologize for your altitude. Do not dilute your vision. Your highest ethical duty is to the truth of your own potential, and the greatest act of defiance is to survive the envy of the small. Choose the hard freedom of the sovereign over the easy comfort of the slave. The myth you must finally abandon is the lie that virtue lies in surrender. It does not. Virtue is the courage to possess your own life fully. Your highest purpose is not to share the light, but to burn so brightly the darkness cannot touch you. If you are one of the few ready to stop apologizing for your strength, then subscribe now to join the community that believes in the supremacy of the individual mind. The only true ethical failing is to die before you have become who you were meant to be.